The scent hit Vita like a plasma blast, overwhelming her senses and triggering a cascade of alien hormones. She froze mid-stride, her towering Hazari frame rigid with shock. The source? A human male, clad in the distinctive armor of the Interstellar Alliance, patrolling the perimeter of Outpost XR7. Richard Bennett's routine check had just become anything but routine. He spotted the Hazari warrior, her pearl-white skin gleaming under the harsh lights of the frontier station. His hand instinctively moved to his sidearm, muscles tensing as he prepared for a potential threat. The buffer zone between human and Hazari space crackled with tension. XR7 stood as humanity's first line of defense against the expansionist Hazari Dominion. Every encounter could spark a war. Richard activated his comlink, voice low and steady. "Control, we have a Hazari presence on the East Quadrant, requesting backup and instructions." Vita's four eyes locked onto Richard, her mandibles clicking in agitation. She took a step forward, then halted, visibly fighting an internal battle. Richard's unique pheromones assaulted her olfactory organs, triggering responses her warrior training hadn't prepared her for. "State your purpose," Richard called out, following first contact protocols. His finger hovered near the trigger, ready but not aggressive. Vita's reply came in halting bursts, her translator struggling to keep up with her scattered thoughts. The fleet." Richard's brow furrowed. "Fleet? What fleet?" Vita's eyes widened, realizing her mistake. She'd revealed classified information, the invasion plans slipping out in her hormone-addled state. Alarms blared across the outpost. The AI had detected the conversation, alerting command to the potential threat. Richard's comm crackled to life. "Detain the Hazari for questioning. Use force if necessary." Vita spun, her powerful legs propelling her down the corridor. Richard gave chase, boots pounding on metal grates as they weaved through the station's maze-like structure. They reached a sealed airlock, Vita's escape cut off. She turned, cornered, her hand reaching for a concealed device. A pulse erupted, and the outpost systems flickered. Security cameras went dark, blast doors slammed shut. Richard seized the moment, launching himself at the Hazari warrior. They collided, Richard's tackle bringing them into close contact. Vita's reaction intensified, the proximity to Richard's scent overwhelming her senses. With a growl, she flipped their positions, pinning Richard against the airlock door. Her superior strength held him immobile, their faces inches apart. Richard could see the conflict in her alien features, feel the tremors running through her powerful frame. The sound of approaching boots echoed down the corridor. Human reinforcements were on their way. Richard met Vita's gaze, his mind racing. He sensed an opportunity in her apparent interest. "We don't have to fight," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Whatever's happening to you, whatever this is between us, we can figure it out together." Vita's grip loosened slightly, uncertainty replacing the hostility in her eyes. The fate of two species hung in the balance as she wrestled with her decision. The Hazari invasion fleet loomed in the darkness of space, awaiting her signal. Yet here, pressed against this human, Vita faced a choice that could reshape the galaxy. Richard held his breath, acutely aware of Vita's alien biology reacting to his presence. The approaching soldiers were moments away. Everything hinged on what the Hazari warrior would do next. Vita's grip on Richard loosened, her alien features softening. In that moment, Richard saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath her warrior exterior. But before he could react, Vita's hand shot to a device on her belt. A shimmering field enveloped her form, and she vanished from sight. Richard blinked, momentarily stunned by her sudden disappearance. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted him back to reality. A squad of Alliance soldiers rounded the corner, weapons at the ready. Their leader, a grizzled sergeant, barked, "Bennett, report!" Richard's mind raced. He could feel Vita's presence nearby, her alien pheromones still tickling his senses. In a split-second decision, he chose to protect her. "The intruder fled through the airlock," Richard lied, gesturing to the sealed door behind him. "I couldn't stop them in time." The sergeant cursed, then activated his comm. "Control, this is Gamma Squad. Intruder has escaped the station. requesting immediate space sweep. As the squad secured the area, Richard's comm crackled to life. Commander Marcus Stone's stern voice filled the channel. All personnel, this is not a drill. We have a confirmed Hazari infiltration. Full lockdown protocols are now in effect. Report any suspicious activity immediately. The base transformed into a hive of activity. Blast doors slammed shut, and security teams swept through every corridor. Richard found himself assigned to a search team, secretly relieved for the opportunity to look for Vida. As they combed through the living quarters, Richard became acutely aware of a faint, alluring scent following him. Vida's pheromones, now intensified, seemed to call out to him. He struggled to maintain his focus, his body responding in ways he couldn't control. "You all right, Bennett?" his teammate asked, noticing his distraction. Richard nodded, forcing himself to concentrate. "Just on edge. Let's keep moving." In the shadows, Vida fought her own battle. Her cloaking device flickered, struggling against the surge of hormones flooding her system. She pressed herself against a wall, willing her body to obey as a patrol passed by. Across the station, in the science lab, Dr. Elena Reeves frowned at her console. "Commander," she called over the comm, "I'm detecting unusual energy readings. They match known Hazari signatures." Commander Stone's reply was immediate. "Pinpoint the source, Doctor. All teams, be advised. We may have active Hazari tech on the station." The news sent a ripple of tension through the search parties. Richard felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. He needed to find Vida before anyone else did. Seizing a moment when his team rounded a corner, Richard slipped away. He followed the tantalizingly familiar scent, his heart pounding with each step. It led him to a secluded maintenance bay, filled with humming machinery and twisting pipes. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Vida's cloaking device failed completely, revealing her crouched form behind a power converter. Their eyes met, and Richard felt an electric jolt course through him. Vida rose slowly, her powerful frame trembling with the effort of restraint. "Human," she growled, her translator struggling to convey the complex emotions in her voice. Richard raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "Vida, listen to me. You need to surrender. If they find you like this—" "No," Vida snarled, her mandibles clicking rapidly. "My mission, my people—" "Your invasion, you mean?" Richard pressed, taking a cautious step forward. "Is that really the answer?" Vida's four eyes blinked in rapid succession. "You don't understand. We have no choice. My species, we face extinction." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He stared at Vida, seeing her in a new light. Extinction? But why? An alarm blared overhead, cutting him off. A computerized voice announced, "Intruder located in Maintenance Bay 4. All units converge." Panic flashed across Vida's alien features. Richard made his decision in an instant. "This way," he said, grabbing her arm. "There's a maintenance shuttle in Bay 6. We can get you out of here." They raced through the winding corridors, Richard's intimate knowledge of the station guiding their path. Vida followed close behind, her powerful strides matching his pace. As they approached the shuttle bay, a familiar voice called out, "Freeze!" Richard skidded to a halt, Vida nearly colliding with him. Lieutenant James Harper stood before them, his weapon trained on Vida. "I knew something was off about you, Bennett," Harper sneered. "Fraternizing with the enemy? That's treason." Richard slowly raised his hands. "James, wait. It's not what you think. There's more going on here." "Save it for the court-martial," Harper snapped. He tapped his comm. "Control, this is Lieutenant Harper. I've apprehended the intruder and—" Vida moved with blinding speed. In a blur of white limbs, she disarmed Harper and pinned him against the wall. Her hand hovered over his throat, claws extended. Richard's heart raced. The next few seconds would determine the fate of not just Vida, but potentially two entire species. He had to find a way to defuse the situation before it spiraled into the very war they were trying to prevent. "Vida," he said softly, stepping closer. "Remember what we talked about. This isn't the way." Vida's eyes darted between Richard and Harper, her body quivering with tension. The sound of approaching boots echoed down the corridor. Time was running out. Vida's hand trembled, her claws mere inches from Harper's throat. Richard's words hung in the air, a lifeline in the chaos. The approaching footsteps grew louder, echoing through the corridor. "Please," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't who you are, Vita." Harper's eyes darted between them, confusion and anger warring on his face. "Bennett, what the hell is going on? You're defending this invader?" Before Richard could respond, Harper's hand inched towards his sidearm. Vita noticed the movement, her muscles tensing in preparation. "Don't," Richard shouted, but it was too late. Time seemed to slow as Harper drew his weapon. Vita, acting on pure instinct, released her grip on the lieutenant and lunged towards Richard. Harper's finger squeezed the trigger, the energy weapon discharging with a brilliant flash. Richard moved without thinking, pushing Vita aside. The blast caught him squarely in the chest, hurling him against the wall. He crumpled to the floor, a searing pain spreading through his body. "Richard!" Vita's cry was filled with anguish, her translator unable to fully convey the emotion behind it. Harper stood frozen, his weapon still raised, shock evident on his face. I didn't mean to." Vita knelt beside Richard, her hands hovering over his wounded form, unsure how to help. The sound of running feet grew closer, and suddenly the corridor was filled with Alliance soldiers, led by Commander Marcus Stone. "Stand down!" Stone's authoritative voice cut through the chaos. His eyes quickly assessed the scene, taking in the injured Richard, the distraught Hazari, and the shell-shocked Harper. "Sir," Harper stammered, "I can explain." Stone cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Stow it, Lieutenant. You're relieved of duty pending investigation." He turned to the medical team that had arrived with him. "Get Bennett to the medbay now." As the medics rushed to Richard's side, Vita found herself surrounded by soldiers, their weapons trained on her. She made no move to resist, her 4 eyes fixed on Richard's pale face as he was lifted onto a stretcher. "Commander," Vita said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her limbs, "I must speak with you. It's urgent." Stone regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Very well, but you'll do so in custody. Sergeant, escort our guest to the secure conference room. I want a full security detail." As Vita was led away, she cast one last glance at Richard. Their eyes met briefly before he was whisked around the corner towards the medical bay. In the sterile confines of the outpost's advanced medical facility, Dr. Eleanor Reeves worked feverishly to stabilize Richard's condition. Her hands moved with practiced precision, applying regenerative compounds to the energy weapon's burn site. "Vitals stabilizing," one of her assistants reported. "But there's something odd in his blood work, Doctor." Reeves frowned, studying the holographic display of Richard's bioreadings. "These hormone levels, they're off the charts. And look at this protein marker. I've never seen anything like it." As she delved deeper into the anomalies, a theory began to form in her mind. The implications were staggering. Meanwhile, in the conference room, Vita stood before Commander Stone and his senior staff. Despite her imposing physical presence, there was a vulnerability in her stance that gave Stone pause. "Speak," he said simply. Vita took a deep breath, her mandibles clicking softly. "Commander, what I'm about to tell you may seem impossible, but I assure you it's the truth. The Hazari fleet approaching your outpost, it's not just an invasion force. It's our last hope for survival." She went on to explain the genetic crisis facing her people, the looming threat of extinction that drove them to such desperate measures. As she spoke, the base's long-range sensors lit up, confirming the approach of the Hazari fleet. Stone listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Vita finished, he turned to his science officer. "Verify her claims. I want every scrap of data we have on Hazari biology analyzed." He faced Vita again, his tone measured. "If what you say is true, it changes things. But it doesn't excuse the actions taken against this outpost." "I understand," Vita replied, her head bowing slightly. "But please, Commander, there may be a way for both our peoples to survive this crisis." Before Stone could respond, his comm unit chirped. "Commander?" Dr. Reeves's voice came through, excitement evident in her tone. You need to see this. I've made a discovery about Bennett's condition that could change everything. Stone's eyes narrowed, his tactical mind already connecting the dots. He turned to his second-in-command. Continue debriefing our guest. I need to check on Bennett's status. In the medical bay, Richard drifted in and out of consciousness. Through the haze of pain and medication, he caught snippets of conversation. Dr. Reeves's voice, explaining something about pheromones and genetic compatibility. Commander Stone's gruff replies, asking for clarification on potential implications. Richard forced his eyes open, his vision slowly focusing on the concerned face of Dr. Reeves. "Doc," he managed to croak, "what's happening?" Reeves smiled down at him, her eyes bright with the thrill of scientific discovery. "Rest easy, Bennett. You may have just saved 2 species without even knowing it." As Richard processed her words, his thoughts turned to Vita. He needed to see her, to make sure she was safe. But more than that, he needed to understand the connection between them, a bond that seemed to transcend biology and politics. Commander Stone stepped into view, his face a mask of persistence. "Bennett, how soon can you be on your feet? We're going to need you for what's coming next." Richard struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in his chest. "Sir, what's our next move?" Stone's reply was cut off by a series of alarms. A voice came over the station-wide comm system. "Attention all personnel. Hazari fleet has entered sensor range. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill." The medical bay erupted into activity. Richard locked eyes with Commander Stone, both men aware that the next few hours would determine the fate of 2 civilizations. The time for talk was over. Now they had to act. Act. Richard gritted his teeth against the pain in his chest as he swung his legs off the medical bed. "I'm ready, sir," he said, meeting Commander Stone's determined gaze. The station shuddered as the first volleys of weapons fire were exchanged between the human and Hazari ships. Dr. Reeves rushed to Richard's side, steadying him as he stood. "You're not fully healed," she cautioned, but Richard shook his head. "No time for that now, Doc. We need to stop this before it escalates." Commander Stone nodded grimly. "Follow me. We're heading to the command center." As they hurried through the corridors, Richard's mind raced. He needed to see Vita, to make sure she was safe, to understand what Dr. Reeves had discovered about their connection. But duty came first. They entered the bustling command center, where officers shouted status reports and tactical displays flickered with real-time battle data. Stone immediately took charge, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Cease fire, all ships. Stand down immediately." He turned to his communications officer. "Get me a direct line to the Hazari fleet." Richard scanned the room, relief washing over him as he spotted Vita standing near a tactical display, her alien features tense but composed. Their eyes met, and he felt that inexplicable pull between them intensify. "Sir," Richard said, stepping closer to Stone, "let me speak to them. I think I can help." Stone hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Make it count, Bennett." Richard took a deep breath and stepped up to the communications array. The main view screen flickered to life, revealing the face of a Hazari commander, mandibles clicking in agitation. "This is Richard Bennett of Outpost XR7, he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We request an immediate cessation of hostilities and propose emergency negotiations." The Hazari commander's 4 eyes blinked rapidly. "Human, your kind has already made their position clear. Why should we trust you now?" Richard glanced at Vita, who nodded encouragingly. He turned back to the screen. "Because we've made a discovery that could change everything. A potential solution to your genetic crisis." The command center fell silent, all eyes on the monitor. The Hazari commander's mandibles stilled, his gaze intensifying. "Explain," he demanded. Before Richard could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Belay that order, Bennett." Admiral Thorne strode into the command center, flanked by a contingent of armed officers. His hawkish features were set in a scowl as he surveyed the room. "Commander Stone, you are relieved of duty," Thorne announced. "I'm assuming control of this outpost under Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha." Stone's face darkened with anger. "On whose authority?" The Human Interstellar Alliance Council, Thorne replied smoothly, producing a data chip. Your diplomatic approach has failed, Commander. It's time for decisive action. Richard felt a surge of panic. He looked to Vita, seeing his own concern mirrored in her alien eyes. Everything they'd worked for was about to unravel. Sir, Richard interjected, addressing Thorne directly, with all due respect, you don't understand the situation. We're on the brink of a breakthrough that could prevent this war entirely. Thorne's cold gaze settled on Richard. Ah, yes, Bennett. I've heard about your unique involvement with the enemy. His lip curled in distaste. You'll be debriefed thoroughly, I assure you. Vita stepped forward, her powerful frame tense with awe-inspiring emotion. Admiral, if you proceed with military action, you doom both our species. The human Richard Bennett may hold the key to our survival. Is that so? Thorne's eyebrows raised in mock interest. Well then, perhaps we can come to an arrangement. Your advanced technology in exchange for breeding stock? A ripple of disgust passed through the room. Richard felt a surge of anger, his fists clenching at his sides. That's not what we're proposing, Dr. Reeves interjected, her voice tight with almost unchecked outrage. My research suggests a potential for genetic stabilization, not some barbaric breeding program. Thorne waved a dismissive hand. Details to be worked out later. For now, we need to secure our tactical advantage. He turned to his officers. Detain Commander Stone and his senior staff. Prepare to engage the Hazari fleet. As Thorne's men moved to carry out his orders, Richard locked eyes with Vita. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They couldn't let this happen. Richard edged closer to Vita, his voice barely a whisper. We need to act fast. Can you get a message to your ship? Vita's mandibles clicked softly. Yes, but what's the plan? We need to buy time, Richard murmured, and we need access to Dr. Reeves's research. It's our only chance to prove there's another way. As they spoke, chaos erupted in the command center. Stone and his loyal officers resisted Thorne's attempt to seize control, resulting in a tense standoff. Alarms blared as the Hazari fleet, confused by the sudden change in human leadership, resumed their advance. Richard knew they had only moments before the situation spiraled beyond their control. He caught Dr. Reeves's eye and gave a subtle nod. She understood, quietly slipping away from the commotion towards her lab. Follow my lead, Richard whispered to Vita. Then louder he addressed the room. Admiral Thorne, I request permission to continue negotiations with the Hazari. My unique position might be our best chance at a peaceful resolution. Thorne turned, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. And why should I trust you, Bennett? Richard stood tall, ignoring the pain in his chest. Because I'm the only one who can communicate effectively with both sides. And because if we don't find a peaceful solution, we're looking at a war that could destroy us all. As Thorne considered his words, Richard silently prayed that their hastily formed plan would work. Everything hinged on the next few moments, and the fate of two species hung in the balance. Balance. Richard knew they had precious little time to act. Admiral, he said, his voice steady despite the tension coursing through him. I understand your concern, but I believe I can demonstrate the value of peaceful negotiation. Give me 1 hour with the Hazari representatives. If I can't make progress, you can proceed as you see fit. Thorne's eyes narrowed, considering Richard's proposal. The command center hung in tense silence, broken only by the urgent beeping of sensor arrays tracking the advancing Hazari fleet. Very well, Bennett, Thorne said finally. 1 hour, but I want you under close observation. Richard nodded, relief washing over him. He turned to Vita, speaking in a low voice. We need to move fast. Can you get us to Admiral Thorne's ship? Vita's mandibles clicked softly. Yes, but it will be dangerous. Are you certain about this? It's our only chance, Richard replied, his eyes meeting hers with fierce drive. As the others in the command center busied themselves with preparations, Richard and Vita slipped away. They made their way to a small maintenance airlock, where Vita produced a compact device from a hidden compartment in her exosuit. Cloaking technology, she explained, activating the device. A shimmering field enveloped them both, rendering them nearly invisible. Using Vita's cloaking and Richard's knowledge of human protocols, they managed to board Admiral Thorne's command ship, the ISS Vigilant, during a routine supply transfer. They moved swiftly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by the hum of the ship's systems. As they navigated the tight spaces, Richard became acutely aware of Vita's proximity. The faint alien scent of her filled his nostrils, and he could feel the heat radiating from her powerful form. He pushed the distracting thoughts aside, forcing himself to focus on their mission. They reached a junction, pausing as a group of crew members passed by. Richard felt Vita tense beside him, her breath quickening. He realized with a jolt that his pheromones were affecting her more intensely in these close quarters. "Are you all right?" he whispered, concern evident in his voice. Vita's multifaceted eyes fixed on him, a strange intensity in their depths. Yes, we must continue." They pressed on, finally reaching the ship's data core. Richard's fingers flew over the control panel, initiating the download of evidence against Thorne. As the progress bar crept forward, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The door slid open, revealing Lieutenant Commander Sarah Tucker, Thorne's second-in-command. Her hand went to her sidearm as she registered the unauthorized presence in the data core. "Stop right there," Tucker called out, her voice sharp with authority. In that moment, Vita's cloaking device sputtered and failed, revealing her true Hazari form. Tucker's eyes widened in shock, her weapon wavering between Richard and the alien. "Wait," Richard said, holding up his hands. "We can explain. We're here to stop Thorne from starting a war." Tucker's brow furrowed, her grip on the weapon loosening slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Admiral Thorne is planning to destroy Outpost XR7 and blame it on the Hazari," Richard explained quickly. "We have evidence of his illegal activities." To their surprise, Tucker lowered her weapon entirely. "I knew something was wrong," she said, her voice tight with nearly unleashed anger. "I've been gathering evidence against Thorne myself. He's been acting increasingly erratic, making decisions that go against everything the Alliance stands for." Relief flooded through Richard. "Then you'll help us?" Tucker nodded grimly. "I'll do more than that. I have additional evidence that will bury Thorne for good." As Tucker connected her data pad to the core, alarms suddenly blared throughout the ship. Thorne's voice came over the intercom, cold and determined. "Attention all hands. We have intruders aboard. Initiate ship-wide lockdown. Prepare to engage primary weapons. Our target, Outpost X7. The three looked at each other, the gravity of the situation sinking in. They were trapped in the data core, with Thorne about to unleash an attack that would ignite an interspecies war. Richard's mind raced, searching for a solution. His eyes fell on a maintenance panel, an idea forming. "Vita," he said urgently, "with your understanding of Hazari tech and my knowledge of our systems, do you think we could override the weapons?" Vita's mandibles clicked rapidly as she considered the possibility. "It's possible, but extremely dangerous. I would need to interface directly with the ship's computer. The mental strain could be significant." Richard placed a hand on her arm, ignoring the jolt of electricity that seemed to pass between them at the contact. "I'll be right here with you. We can do this." As Vita began the dangerous process of connecting to the ship's systems, Tucker took up a defensive position by the door. "I'll hold them off as long as I can," she said, her weapon at the ready. Richard stayed by Vita's side, watching as her eyes glazed over, her consciousness merging with the ship's complex systems. He could see the strain on her face, feel the trembling in her powerful frame. Suddenly, Vita gasped, her body going rigid. Richard instinctively moved closer, his hand finding hers. To his amazement, he felt a surge of energy pass between them, and Vita's trembling subsided. "It's working," she murmured, her voice distant. "I can see the weapon systems. Just a little more." Outside, the sounds of combat grew closer as Tucker engaged Thorne's security forces. Richard's recent injuries throbbed, reminding him of the physical toll of their mission, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing entirely on supporting Vita. As the minutes ticked by, Richard could feel the tension building. Vita's breathing grew labored, her grip on his hand tightening painfully. Just when he thought she couldn't take any more, She let out a triumphant cry. It's done! The weapons are disabled! But the victory was short-lived. As soon as the words left her mouth, Vida collapsed, her body going limp in Richard's arms. He cradled her, panic rising in his chest. Vida! Vida, can you hear me? As he held her, he felt a strange sensation washing over him. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a cocoon of energy. Richard remembered Dr. Reeves's findings about their unique biological compatibility and realized that his proximity might be key to Vida's recovery. He pulled her closer, willing his strength into her. Slowly, achingly slowly, Vida's eyes began to flutter open. As their gazes met, Richard felt a connection so intense it took his breath away. The moment was shattered by Tucker's urgent voice. They're coming! We need to move now! Reality crashed back in. They had disabled the weapons, but Thorne was still in control of the ship. They needed to find a way to expose his treachery and prevent the war he was so intent on starting. As Richard helped Vida to her feet, their eyes met once more. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, a new dimension to their already complex relationship. But there was no time to explore these feelings. They had a mission to complete, 2 civilizations to save. With renewed perseverance, Richard turned to Tucker and Vida. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Let's end this. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Let's end this madness. Richard led the way out of the data core, his mind racing with their next steps. The corridors of the ISS Vigilant were a maze of flashing red emergency lights and blaring alarms. As they moved, Tucker quickly briefed them on the ship's layout. The bridge is 2 decks up, she explained, her voice tense. But Thorne's men will be expecting us. As if on cue, a group of security officers rounded the corner ahead, weapons raised. Richard instinctively pushed Vida behind him, while Tucker took cover behind a bulkhead. Surrender now, one of the officers shouted. Instead of complying, Richard locked eyes with Vida. Without a word, she understood. In one fluid motion, she activated her cloaking device, the shimmering field enveloping them both. The security team's momentary confusion gave Tucker the opening she needed. She fired her weapon, set to stun, dropping 2 officers before they could react. Richard and Vida moved in tandem, their earlier connection seeming to heighten their coordination. Vida's powerful Hazari physique combined with Richard's tactical training made them a formidable duo. They disarmed the remaining officers swiftly, leaving them unconscious but unharmed. As they continued their ascent towards the bridge, Richard couldn't help but notice the way Vida moved, her alien grace captivating even in the midst of danger. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. They encountered several more pockets of resistance as they made their way through the ship. Each time their teamwork grew more seamless, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization. The air between them crackled with an energy that went beyond mere adrenaline. Finally, they reached the ship's environmental control center. Tucker quickly assessed the systems, her fingers flying over the control panels. We can use this, she said, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. If we alter the atmosphere in specific sections, we can incapacitate Thorne's forces without causing permanent harm. Vida stepped forward, her multifaceted eyes scanning the complex array of controls. I can interface with the ship's systems, she said. My abilities should allow for precise manipulation. As Vida began to work, Richard took up a defensive position by the door. He watched her, marveling at the way she seemed to merge with the technology, her consciousness extending into the ship's systems. Beads of sweat formed on her exoskeleton, and he could see the strain in her eyes. Without thinking, Richard moved closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. The effect was immediate and electric. Vida's breathing steadied, and her movements became more fluid. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the chaos around them faded away. The spell was broken by Tucker's urgent voice. Incoming security team! We need to move! Vida disengaged from the system, her work complete. As the approaching footsteps grew louder, Richard made a split-second decision. He pulled Vida close, their bodies pressing together in the narrow space behind the control panel. The security team burst into the room, weapons drawn. Tucker, hidden behind a bulkhead, held her breath. For a tense moment, it seemed they would be discovered. But then, the effects of Vita's atmospheric alterations began to take hold. The security team swayed on their feet, their movements becoming sluggish before they collapsed to the floor unconscious. As the danger passed, Richard became acutely aware of Vita's proximity. Her alien scent filled his nostrils, and he could feel the heat radiating from her powerful form. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the tension that had been building between them reached a breaking point. Their lips met in a passionate embrace, the biochemical compatibility between them manifesting in a surge of almost electrical energy. For a brief, intense moment, they were lost in each other, the boundaries between human and Hazari blurring. The sound of Tucker clearing her throat brought them back to reality. "I hate to interrupt," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice, "but we have a mission to complete." Reluctantly, Richard and Vita separated, both slightly dazed from the intensity of their connection. They shared a look that promised further exploration of these feelings once their task was done. With restored dedication, they pressed on towards the bridge. As they approached, the ship's intercom crackled to life. Admiral Thorne's voice filled with terrifying rage. "Attention all hands! The traitors are approaching the bridge. Stop them at all costs and initiate the self-destruct sequence. Authorization, Thorne Alpha 09. Richard's blood ran cold. Thorne was willing to destroy the entire ship to cover his tracks. They were out of time. "Tucker," Richard said, his voice tight with urgency, "can you get to the engine room and stop that self-destruct?" Tucker nodded grimly. "I'll do my best. You two get to the bridge and expose Thorne." As Tucker raced off towards the engine room, Richard and Vita shared a determined look. They were the only thing standing between Thorne and interstellar war. With no time to waste, they made their final push towards the bridge, knowing that the fate of both their species hung in the balance. With no time to waste, they made their final push towards the bridge, knowing that the fate of both their species hung in the balance. As they reached the bridge's sealed doors, the ship lurched violently, nearly throwing them off their feet. The self-destruct sequence had begun. Richard's mind raced. "We need to evacuate the ship," he said urgently. "Exposing Thorne won't matter if we're all dead." Vita nodded, her multifaceted eyes reflecting the flashing red emergency lights. "I can interface with the ship's systems one last time. We can broadcast an evacuation order and transmit the evidence simultaneously." Without hesitation, Richard helped Vita access a nearby computer terminal. As she connected, he felt the familiar surge of energy between them, their unique biochemical compatibility allowing him to lend her strength. Vita's consciousness flooded into the ship's systems. She quickly created multiple encrypted copies of the evidence, preparing them for transmission to key figures in both the Human Interstellar Alliance and the Hazari fleet. Meanwhile, Richard accessed the ship's communication array. His voice rang out through every speaker on the ISS Vigilant. "Attention all hands. This is Lieutenant Richard Hawke. The ship's self-destruct sequence has been activated. This is not a drill. Evacuate immediately. Repeat, evacuate immediately." The effect was instantaneous. Alarms blared with renewed intensity, and the sounds of panicked crew members filled the corridors. Thorne's loyalists, caught off guard by the sudden chaos, found their organized resistance crumbling. Tucker's voice crackled over their comm units. "I've overridden the security protocols for the escape pods. You should be able to launch without authorization now." "Good work," Richard replied. "Meet us at the escape pod bay on Deck C." As Vita disengaged from the system, the ship shuddered again. The deck beneath their feet groaned ominously. "Structural integrity is failing," Vita reported, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to move. Now." They raced through the corridors, their movements perfectly synchronized. Years of training and their growing connection allowed them to anticipate each other's actions, making them an unstoppable force as they navigated the chaos. A massive explosion rocked the ship, and a section of the corridor ahead of them collapsed. Without missing a beat, Richard and Vita changed course, finding an alternative route through maintenance tunnels. The air grew thin as life support systems began to fail. Richard's earlier injuries throbbed with renewed intensity, but he pushed through the pain. Vita noticed his struggle and placed a supportive hand on his back, the contact sending a jolt of energy through him. They burst into the escape pod bay, finding Tucker already there, her fingers flying over a control panel. "I've disabled the tracking systems on several pods," she reported. "It should make it harder for anyone to follow us." As they boarded the nearest pod, Vita made one final connection to the ship's systems. "Transmitting evidence now," she announced. The pod's hatch sealed with a hiss, and Tucker initiated the launch sequence. Through the viewport, they watched as other escape pods jettisoned from the dying ship, scattering in all directions. Their pod shot away from the ISS Vigilant just as the ship's reactor went critical. A blinding flash lit up space, followed by a shockwave that sent their small craft tumbling. Inside the pod, they were thrown against each other. Richard found himself pressed against Vita, their faces inches apart. For a moment, the chaos around them faded away, replaced by the electric tension between them. The pod's stabilizers kicked in, ending the moment. As they regained their bearings, Tucker's voice cut through the silence. "We're drifting into Hazari space," she said, her tone a mix of concern and calculation. "This could be our chance to make direct contact with their leadership." Vita's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "I may be able to use my pheromones to influence any rescue party we encounter. It's risky, but it could buy us time to explain." Richard nodded, trusting Vita's judgment. He couldn't help but notice how their recent ordeals had only strengthened their bond. Even now, in the cramped confines of the escape pod, he felt drawn to her, their unique compatibility creating an almost tangible connection between them. Tucker observed their interaction with interest. "Your relationship," she said carefully, "it could be a powerful symbol of human-Hazari cooperation. If we play this right, it might help smooth over tensions between our species." Before Richard could respond, the pod sensors beeped urgently. A Hazari scout ship was approaching. "This is it," Richard said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Everything we fought for comes down to the next few moments." As the Hazari ship initiated docking procedures, Richard, Vita, and Tucker exchanged determined looks. They had survived impossible odds to reach this point. Now they faced the ultimate test, convincing the Hazari of the truth and preventing an interstellar war. The airlock cycled, preparing to open onto the Hazari ship. Richard felt Vita's hand slip into his, their fingers intertwining. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The airlock hissed open, revealing a group of armed Hazari soldiers. As Vita stepped forward to address her people, Richard stood by her side, ready to fight for peace between their species and for the future they might share. Share them together, and for the future they might build. The airlock hissed open, revealing a squad of heavily armed Hazari soldiers, their weapons trained on the trio. Richard tensed, his hand instinctively tightening around Vita's. The air crackled with tension as the two groups faced each other in a tense standoff. Suddenly, Vita stepped forward, her multifaceted eyes locked on the Hazari troops. As she moved, Richard felt a surge of energy pass between them, amplifying Vita's natural pheromones. The effect on the Hazari soldiers was immediate and visible. Their rigid postures loosened, mandibles clicking in confusion as they lowered their weapons slightly. Taking advantage of their momentary distraction, Vita began speaking rapidly in her native language. Her words flowed with urgency, gesturing emphatically towards Richard and Tucker as she explained their situation and the critical evidence they carried about Admiral Thorne's treachery. The Hazari commander, a tall, imposing figure with intricate markings on her exoskeleton, listened intently. Her antennae twitched as she processed Vita's words, her compound eyes darting between the three escapees. "I am Captain Zara," she announced in accented English, her voice a low, resonant hum. "Your claims are concerning. You will be taken to the detention center for further questioning while we verify your information." As they were escorted through the Hazari vessel, Richard couldn't help but notice the ripple of curiosity and unease that seemed to follow them. Hazari crew members they passed visibly reacted to Vita's presence, some stepping back in surprise, others leaning in with interest. Richard realized that his proximity to Vita was amplifying her effect on her own people in ways they hadn't anticipated. The detention center was a stark, clinical space. Captain Zara directed them to separate holding cells, each enclosed by a shimmering energy field. As the field activated around him, Richard felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The adrenaline that had been keeping him going was wearing off, and the pain from his injuries flared with renewed intensity. Through the haze of discomfort, Richard watched as Captain Zara began reviewing the evidence they had provided. Her demeanor shifted as she delved deeper into the files, her earlier skepticism giving way to grave concern. After what seemed like hours, she abruptly stood and strode out of the room, presumably to contact her superiors. Richard's condition deteriorated rapidly in her absence. His vision blurred and he found himself struggling to stay upright. Vita, in the cell across from him, pressed herself against the energy field, her eyes wide with worry. "Richard," she called out, her voice muffled by the barrier between them. "Stay with me." Before he could respond, the door to the detention center slid open, and a new Hazari entered. This one wore markings that Richard's foggy mind identified as medical insignia. "I am Dr. Lumi," the Hazari announced, deactivating the field around Richard's cell. "Captain Zara has authorized me to treat your injuries." As Dr. Lumi approached, her antennae twitched curiously. She paused, her head tilting as she looked between Richard and Vita. "Fascinating," she murmured, before focusing on Richard's wounds. The Hazari doctor worked swiftly, applying strange-smelling salves and using devices that emitted soft, pulsing lights. As she treated him, Richard noticed her taking samples, a swab of his saliva, a small vial of blood. She did the same with Vita, her actions precise and clinical, but her eyes alight with scientific curiosity. As Richard's pain subsided and his head cleared, he became aware of a commotion outside the detention center. The sound of rapid Hazari speech filtered through the door, punctuated by what seemed to be exclamations of surprise and disbelief. Captain Zara re-entered, her posture tense with barely suppressed excitement. "Your evidence has been verified," she announced, "and there have been developments. You will accompany me to the Hazari flagship immediately." As they were led out of the detention center, Richard found himself drawn closer to Vita. The constant exposure to her pheromones was having an unexpected effect on him. He felt stronger, more alert, as if her presence was somehow enhancing his own physical capabilities. They boarded a sleek shuttle, streaking through space towards a massive vessel that dwarfed the ship they had just left. Richard's heart raced, not just from the gravity of their situation, but from the intensity of his connection with Vita. As they approached the flagship, he realized that whatever happened next would change not just the course of interstellar politics, but the very nature of his relationship with the extraordinary being at his side. The shuttle docked with the flagship, and as the airlock cycled open, Richard squared his shoulders. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. For peace, for Vita, and for a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities he had never before imagined. As the airlock doors slid open, Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself for what lay ahead. The Hazari flagship's interior was a marvel of alien engineering, its corridors lined with pulsating bioluminescent panels that cast an eerie glow over the assembled dignitaries. Captain Zara led them through a series of winding passages, finally arriving at a vast chamber that could only be the War Council's meeting room. Arrayed in a semicircle were the most powerful Hazari in the galaxy, their exoskeletons adorned with intricate markings denoting their rank and status. At the center sat an imposing figure whose presence commanded immediate attention, the Hazari Prime Counselor. "Approach!" The Prime Counselor's voice resonated through the chamber, a deep, multi-tone sound that seemed to vibrate in Richard's bones. As they stepped forward, Richard felt Vita's hand brush against his, a subtle gesture of reassurance. He glanced at her, marveling at how composed she appeared in the face of such scrutiny. The Prime Counselor's compound eyes swept over them, lingering on the point where Richard and Vita stood close together. "We have reviewed the evidence you provided," he announced. "It is most troubling." For the next several hours, Richard, Vita, and Tucker were questioned extensively about Admiral Thorne's conspiracy, the synthetic pheromone project, and the unique bond between Richard and Vita. As they spoke, Richard noticed a shift in the council members' demeanor. their initial hostility giving way to cautious interest. Finally, the Prime Counselor raised a clawed hand for silence. "We have reached a decision," he declared. "The Hazari Dominion will pursue a dual-track approach to resolving our crisis and the conflict with humans." A murmur rippled through the assembled dignitaries as the Prime Counselor outlined the plan. The synthetic pheromone prototype would be accepted as an immediate stopgap measure, while resources would be invested in researching the biological compatibility between Richard and Vita. Furthermore, the Prime Counselor continued, "We propose a joint research initiative with the Human Interstellar Alliance. This project will focus on studying the biochemical interaction between the human Richard Hawk and our own Vita. Our goal is to develop a long-term cure for our genetic degradation." Richard's mind reeled at the implications. He glanced at Vita, whose mandibles were clicking rapidly, a sign of excitement he had learned. "You will be transported to a neutral space station orbiting a nearby uninhabited planet," Captain Czar informed them. "The station, which we have named Harmony, will serve as the base for our joint research efforts." As the details of the plan were explained, Richard felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The immediate threat of war had been averted, but he and Vita were now at the center of a galactic-scale scientific endeavor. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Richard, Vita, and Tucker were debriefed by both human and Hazari officials. Dr. Elena Reeves arrived to take charge of the human scientific team, while Dr. Lumi was appointed to lead the Hazari researchers. As they prepared to depart for Harmony Station, Richard found a quiet moment alone with Vita in their temporary quarters on the Hazari flagship. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, studying her alien features that had become so dear to him. Vita's antennae twitched thoughtfully. "I am uncertain," she admitted, "but I believe this is the right path for both our peoples." Richard nodded, reaching out to take her hand. The familiar surge of energy passed between them, a constant reminder of their unique connection. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we're in this together." The journey to Harmony Station was mercifully short. As their shuttle approached, Richard got his first glimpse of the facility that would be their home for the foreseeable future. The station was a gleaming construct of metal and composite materials, its design a blend of human and Hazari aesthetics. As they docked, Richard noticed the heightened security measures in place. Armed guards from both species patrolled the corridors, a stark reminder of the delicate nature of their mission. Dr. Reeves greeted them as they disembarked, her face a mixture of excitement and concern. "Welcome to Harmony," she said, leading them towards the research wing. "We've prepared special quarters for you both. I'm afraid you'll be under constant observation. The data we can gather from your interactions is invaluable." Richard felt Vita stiffen beside him at the mention of constant observation. He squeezed her hand reassuringly, even as his own unease grew. As they settled into their new living space, Richard couldn't help but feel like a specimen in a zoo. Cameras tracked their movements, and sensors constantly monitored their biological readings. The lack of privacy was stifling, but he reminded himself of the importance of their mission. The first few days were a whirlwind of tests and examinations. Blood samples were taken, brain scans were performed, and every interaction between Richard and Vita was meticulously recorded and analyzed. One evening, as they lay in their separate beds, Vita's voice cut through the darkness. "Richard," she said softly, "do you ever regret this?" He turned to face her, barely able to make out her silhouette in the dim light. "Never," he replied without hesitation. "Whatever challenges we face, I'm grateful for every moment with you." As the days turned into weeks, the strain of their situation began to take its toll. The constant scrutiny wore on them both, leading to moments of irritation and conflict. Yet, even as they argued, Richard found that their bond only seemed to grow stronger. One morning, as they prepared for another round of tests, Dr. Reeves burst into their quarters, her eyes wide with excitement. "We've made a breakthrough," she announced breathlessly. "We've identified the mechanism behind your compatibility. Richard, your pheromone signature triggers a cascade of genetic repairs in Vita's DNA. It's unprecedented." As the implications of this discovery sank in, Richard and Vida exchanged a look of wonder and trepidation. They stood on the brink of a scientific revolution that could save the Hazari species. But the path forward was fraught with ethical dilemmas and personal sacrifices. Dr. Reeves continued, her voice lowering. There's more. Our findings suggest that the most effective way to harness this repair mechanism would be through the creation of human Hazari hybrids. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Richard felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He looked at Vida, saw the same mix of shock and uncertainty in her multifaceted eyes. Before either of them could respond, alarms blared throughout the station. Captain Zara's voice crackled over the intercom, urgent and tense. Security breach detected. All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Richard and Vida sprang into action, years of training kicking in. As they moved to secure their quarters, Richard caught a glimpse of chaos unfolding in the corridor outside. Armed figures in unfamiliar uniforms were advancing, their weapons raised. The choice that lay before them, to potentially become the progenitors of a new hybrid species, would have to wait. For now, they had a more immediate threat to face. Richard met Vida's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As the sound of weapons fire echoed through Harmony Station, Richard and Vida prepared to defend their home, their research, and the fragile peace they had worked so hard to achieve. The future of two species hung in the balance, and the next few moments would determine whether their grand experiment in cooperation would survive its first real test. Test! Richard's heart pounded as he and Vida took defensive positions near the entrance to their quarters. The chaos in the corridor intensified, with shouts and the sound of energy weapons growing louder. We need to get to the command center, Richard said, his voice low and urgent. Whatever's happening, we can't let this station fall. Vida nodded, her antennae twitching rapidly. Agreed. But we must be cautious. We don't know who these intruders are or what they want. As they prepared to make their move, Dr. Reeves's earlier words echoed in Richard's mind. Human Hazari hybrids. The implications of that revelation would have to wait. Right now, survival was their priority. They slipped into the corridor, moving swiftly and silently. Years of training allowed them to work in perfect synchronization, covering each other as they navigated the chaos-filled passageways of Harmony Station. As they rounded a corner, they encountered a group of armed intruders. Richard recognized the insignia on their uniforms, a stylized image of Earth surrounded by a protective barrier. His blood ran cold. Pure Earth, a human supremacist group known for their violent opposition to alien integration. Without hesitation, Richard and Vida sprang into action. Richard's combat training melded seamlessly with Vida's Hazari martial prowess. They moved as one, disarming and incapacitating the intruders with ruthless efficiency. As the last attacker fell, Richard caught Vida's gaze. In that moment, he saw a reflection of his own willpower and fear. They were more than just research subjects now. They were defenders of everything they had worked for. They pressed on, fighting their way through pockets of resistance. Along the way, they encountered other station personnel, both human and Hazari, joining forces to repel the invaders. Finally, they reached the command center. Captain Zara was there, coordinating the defense with a mix of human Interstellar Alliance and Hazari Dominion forces. Richard, Vida, she acknowledged them, her compound eyes flickering with relief. We've identified the attackers. It's not just pure Earth. There's a Hazari extremist group involved as well. The genetic purists. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. They're working together? It appears so, Zara confirmed. They've united in their goal to stop the hybrid project. The implications hit Richard like a physical blow. Their work, their very existence as a bonded human Hazari pair, had become a flashpoint for extremists on both sides. As if reading his thoughts, Vida placed a hand on his arm. We knew there would be opposition, she said softly, but we cannot let fear dictate our actions. Richard nodded, drawing strength from her touch. What's our next move, Captain? Before Zara could respond, alarms blared throughout the station. A technician called out, "Multiple ships dropping out of FTL. They're on an attack vector." On the main view screen, a fleet of unmarked vessels appeared, weapons primed and closing fast. "It's a coordinated assault," Zara growled. "They must have been planning this for months." As the gravity of the situation sank in, Richard realized that the decision he and Vita faced was no longer just about scientific breakthrough or personal choice. It had become a pivotal moment in human-Hazari relations. Commander Marcus Stone's voice crackled over the comms. "This is Commander Stone of the Joint Task Force. All non-essential personnel, evacuate immediately to the nearby Human Interstellar Alliance outpost. Core research team and key defenders, prepare for lockdown procedures." Richard and Vita exchanged a look. They knew without speaking that they would be staying. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As the evacuation began, Dr. Reeves and Dr. Loomy rushed into the command center, carrying data pads and portable research equipment. "We can't lose this research," Dr. Reeves said breathlessly. "It's too important." Captain Zara nodded grimly. "Agreed. You'll be moved to the secure bunker along with Richard and Vita. We can't risk either the research or our primary subjects falling into enemy hands." As they prepared to move to the bunker, the station shuddered under the first wave of attacks. Through the viewports, Richard could see flashes of weapons fire as Harmony's defenders engaged the extremist fleet. The small group made their way through the emptying corridors, the sounds of battle growing more intense with each passing moment. Richard felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Their decision to pursue the hybrid solution had led to this moment of crisis. As they reached the entrance to the bunker, a nearby explosion rocked the station. Richard stumbled, caught by Vita's steady grip. Their eyes met, and in that moment all the doubts and fears of the past weeks seemed to fall away. "Whatever happened," Richard said softly, "I don't regret a moment of this." Vita's mandibles clicked in what Richard now recognized as a smile. "Nor do I," she replied. They entered the bunker, the heavy doors sealing behind them with a resounding thud. As the sounds of battle became muffled, Richard and Vita found themselves at the heart of a storm that would determine not just their fate, but the future of human-Hazari relations. Dr. Reeves and Dr. Loomy immediately set to work, securing their research data and preparing for any eventuality. Richard and Vita stood side by side, ready to defend their work and their bond against whatever came next. The bunker's communication system crackled to life, Commander Stone's voice tense but controlled. "Extremist forces have breached the outer defenses. We're engaging them in close-quarters combat. Stand by for further updates." As the battle raged above them, Richard and Vita could only wait, their fingers intertwined, for the moment when they would be called upon to make their stand. The fate of two species hung in the balance, and the next few hours would determine whether their grand experiment in cooperation would survive its first real test. The bunker's reinforced walls muffled the sounds of battle, but the tension inside was palpable. Richard and Vita stood side by side, their bodies tense and ready for action. Dr. Reeves and Dr. Loomy huddled over their equipment, frantically working to preserve their invaluable research data. Suddenly, the bunker's heavy door shuddered under a series of violent impacts. Richard instinctively moved in front of Vita, his heart racing. The door burst open with a deafening clang, and a group of armed figures rushed in. To everyone's surprise and relief, it was Commander Marcus Stone and his team of human and Hazari soldiers. "Area secure," Stone announced, his voice firm but filled with urgency. "We've managed to push back the main assault force, but we're not out of danger yet." As Stone's team secured the bunker, Dr. Reeves stepped forward, her eyes blazing with dedication. "Commander, we need to proceed with the hybrid procedure immediately." Stone's eyebrows shot up. "Now? In the middle of an attack?" Dr. Loomy joined her colleague, his Hazari features set in a grim expression. The successful creation of a human-Hazari hybrid could be the key to ending this conflict. It would prove, beyond any doubt, the viability of our cooperation. Richard and Vita exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. The weight of the decision pressed down on them, but in that moment, they knew what they had to do. "We'll do it," Richard said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Vita nodded, her antenna quivering slightly. Whatever the risk, we must try. With the medical bay compromised, they quickly transformed a section of the bunker into a makeshift research lab. Dr. Reeves began the process of genetically modifying Richard to enhance his pheromone production, while Dr. Loomy prepared Vita for the complex fertilization process. Richard gritted his teeth as waves of pain washed over him, his body struggling to adapt to the genetic modifications. His senses went haywire, every sound and touch amplified to an excruciating degree. Beside him, Vita's body convulsed as it responded to Richard's enhanced genetic material in unexpected ways. Dr. Loomy's voice cut through Richard's haze of pain. Her physiology is mutating rapidly. I'm having trouble stabilizing her. Through the fog of agony, Richard reached out, his fingers finding Vita's hand. He squeezed it gently, drawing strength from her touch even as he gave her his own. Outside the bunker, the battle for Harmony Station raged on. Commander Stone's voice crackled over the comm system, reporting a desperate assault by the extremists on the station's power core. The bunker shook with the force of nearby explosions, adding to the precarious nature of the procedure. Inside, Dr. Reeves and Dr. Loomy worked tirelessly, their movements a choreographed dance of precision and urgency. Sweat beaded on their foreheads as they made split-second adjustments, fighting to keep Richard and Vita stable. Time seemed to stretch and compress, seconds feeling like hours as the procedure progressed. Richard's world narrowed to the sound of medical equipment, the sharp smell of antiseptic, and the warmth of Vita's hand in his. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the station. The lights in the bunker flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. For several heart-stopping seconds, the only sound was the ragged breathing of those in the room. When the emergency power kicked in, bathing the lab in a dim red glow, Dr. Reeves and Dr. Loomy rushed to check on their patients and the status of the hybrid embryo. What they saw left them speechless. The embryo, now visible to the naked eye, pulsed with an otherworldly energy. It emitted a soft, bioluminescent glow that combined the characteristic hues of both human and Hazari biology. As Richard and Vita regained consciousness, their eyes were immediately drawn to the miraculous sight. Despite their exhaustion and the chaos surrounding them, they felt a profound connection to each other and to the new life they had created. The moment was interrupted by Commander Stone bursting into the bunker. "Reinforcements have arrived," he announced breathlessly. "The extremist threat has been neutralized, but—" His voice trailed off as he caught sight of the glowing embryo. The successful creation of the human-Hazari hybrid marked a turning point, not just in the conflict between the two species, but in the course of galactic history. As news began to spread throughout Harmony Station and beyond, Richard and Vita found themselves at the center of a new chapter in human-Hazari relations. Exhausted but filled with a sense of wonder, Richard turned to Vita. Her alien features, once so foreign to him, now felt as familiar and beloved as his own reflection. They had taken an incredible risk, and in doing so, they had changed the course of history. As the implications of their sacrifice and the miracle they'd helped create began to unfold, Richard and Vita knew that their journey was nowhere near the end. The hybrid embryo, glowing softly in its containment field, represented not just a scientific breakthrough, but a new hope for lasting peace between their peoples. Commander Stone approached them, his expression a mix of awe and concern. "We've won this battle," he said quietly, "but I have a feeling that our real work is just beginning." Richard nodded, his hands still intertwined with Vita's. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by a bond that now transcended species. The glowing embryo was proof that their two races could not only coexist, but create something entirely new and beautiful together. As the station around them began the process of recovery and repair, Richard, Vita, and their team of scientists prepared to face the next phase of their incredible journey. The hybrid embryo continued to pulse with its otherworldly light, a beacon of hope in a galaxy forever changed by the events on Harmony Station. As the glow of the hybrid embryo filled the bunker with its otherworldly light, a sense of awe settled over the group. Richard and Vita, still recovering from the intense procedure, found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity as news of their successful creation spread throughout Harmony Station and beyond. Within hours, the bunker was transformed into a makeshift press center. Journalists from across human and Hazari space clamored for interviews, their excited chatter filling the once quiet space. Richard and Vida, still weak from the procedure, leaned on each other for support as they faced the barrage of questions. How does it feel to be the first human Hazari couple to create a hybrid child? A human reporter asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Richard glanced at Vida, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. It's overwhelming, he admitted, his voice hoarse. But we're proud to be part of something that could bring our species closer together. Vida clicked her mandibles in agreement. We hope our child will be a symbol of unity and cooperation between our peoples. As the days passed, the embryo continued to develop at an astonishing rate. Dr. Reeves and Dr. Loomy worked tirelessly, monitoring its progress around the clock. They marveled at the perfect blend of human and Hazari traits, visible even at this early stage. The rate of cellular division is unlike anything I've ever seen, Dr. Reeves murmured, her eyes glued to the microscope. It's as if the best traits of both species are working in harmony to accelerate growth. Dr. Loomy nodded, his antennae twitching with excitement. And look at the neural development. It's far more advanced than it should be at this stage. As Richard and Vida regained their strength, they spent every moment they could observing their creation. The embryo's bioluminescent glow seemed to intensify in their presence, pulsing in sync with both of their heartbeats. This unexpected connection deepened their bond, solidifying their commitment to each other and their hybrid child. One afternoon, as they stood hand in hand before the incubation chamber, Richard felt a surge of emotion. I never imagined I could feel this way, he said softly, his eyes fixed on the glowing embryo. It's like our love has taken physical form. Vida squeezed his hand, her mandibles clicking softly in what Richard now recognized as a tender smile. Our child is a bridge between our species, she replied, a living testament to what we can achieve together. Their moment of reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Stone, now sporting the insignia of an admiral. Richard, Vida, he greeted them, his expression a mix of pride and urgency. We have some important visitors on their way. Within hours, Harmony Station was abuzz with activity as diplomatic delegations from both the Human Interstellar Alliance and the Hazari Dominion arrived. The station's main auditorium, hastily repurposed for the occasion, filled with dignitaries eager to witness the miracle firsthand. As Richard and Vida entered the auditorium, a hush fell over the crowd. They made their way to the center of the room, where a specialized transport unit housed their rapidly developing child. The embryo's glow seemed to intensify under the attention, casting a soft, otherworldly light across the faces of the assembled leaders. The human ambassador, a tall woman with silver hair, stepped forward. On behalf of the Human Interstellar Alliance, I extend our deepest gratitude and admiration for your courage and sacrifice, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. The Hazari representative, his exoskeleton gleaming under the lights, clicked his mandibles in agreement. The Hazari Dominion echoes these sentiments. Your actions have opened a new chapter in our shared history. As the diplomat spoke, Dr. Reeves approached Admiral Stone, her expression a mix of excitement and disbelief. Admiral, she whispered urgently, we've made an incredible discovery. The embryo is emitting low-level pheromones that seem to have a calming effect on both humans and Hazari. Stone's eyebrows shot up. Are you certain? Dr. Reeves nodded emphatically. We've run multiple tests. It's subtle, but unmistakable. This could have profound implications for fostering long-term peace between our species. As the implications of this discovery sank in, the assembled leaders began to draft a historic peace treaty. The atmosphere in the room shifted, tensions easing as the hybrid's influence subtly worked its magic. Hours passed as the diplomats worked, their usual disagreements giving way to a spirit of cooperation and understanding. Finally, as the station's day cycle began to dim, the leaders of both civilizations stood before the assembled crowd. The human ambassador held up a data pad, her face beaming with pride. Today we have drafted the Harmony Accord, she announced, her voice ringing with emotion. This treaty not only ends all hostilities between our peoples, but establishes a framework for ongoing scientific cooperation and cultural exchange. The Hazari representative stepped forward, his antennae quivering with excitement. In honor of the station where this miracle occurred and the spirit of unity it represents, we name this agreement the Harmony Accord. As cheers erupted throughout the auditorium, Richard and Vikita stood side by side, their hands intertwined. They gazed at their rapidly developing child, marveling at the unexpected role it was already playing in shaping the future of both their species. The hybrid embryo pulsed with an intense glow, as if sensing the momentous events unfolding around it. As Richard and Vita watched, they saw their child not just as a scientific breakthrough, but as a beacon of hope for a new era of peace and cooperation between humans and Hazari. The signing ceremony was set for the following day, coinciding with a significant milestone in the hybrid's development. As Richard and Vita prepared for the historic event, they couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. Their personal journey had led to this moment, and they knew that the eyes of two civilizations would be upon them.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.